December 10th, 1941. The smoke is still rising from the shattered remains of the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Across the globe, the Allied war machine is in a state of absolute shock, paralyzed by a coordinated Japanese offensive that is sweeping across the Pacific like a tidal wave. With the American battleships resting in the mud of Battleship Row, the entire defense of the Allied Pacific theater suddenly falls squarely onto the shoulders of just two British warships. These aren't just any ships. They are the HMS Prince of Wales, a state-of-the-art super dreadnought, and the HMS Repulse, a legendary battlecruiser. Together, they form Force Z, the ultimate symbol of British imperial might, sent to Singapore to single-handedly deter the Empire of Japan. But in less than 2 hours, under the tropical sun of the South China Sea, that centuries-old illusion of naval supremacy will be violently torn to shreds. Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the tactics, the hardware, and the fatal blunders of military history. If you want to understand how empires rise and fall on the battlefield, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and let us get into the tactical weeds. To understand the sheer magnitude of the disaster that befell Force Z, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic delusion that put those ships in the crosshairs in the first place. For over 2 decades, the British Empire relied on something called the Singapore strategy. Formulated in the 1920s, this doctrine assumed that if Japan ever threatened British interests in the Far East, the Royal Navy would simply dispatch a massive, world-class fleet from European waters to the heavily fortified naval base at Singapore. This fleet would arrive in time to relieve the garrison, cut off Japanese supply lines, and project overwhelming power across the Pacific. It sounded great in a London boardroom in 1925, but by late 1941, reality had completely rewritten the script. Britain was fighting for its very survival in the Battle of the Atlantic, desperately trying to keep German U-boats from starving the home islands. The Royal Navy was stretched to the breaking point. There was no massive fleet to send. Instead, Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a highly controversial political gamble. Against the furious objections of his own Admiralty, Churchill ordered a token force of capital ships to Singapore, believing that the mere presence of a modern battleship would terrify the Japanese into backing down. This is a recurring fatal disease in military history. Sending a heavily armed but completely unsupported vanguard into a theatre of war purely as a political bluff is a recipe for slaughter. We saw the exact same arrogant miscalculation 9 years later when the United States sent Task Force Smith into the Korean War in 1950. A small, under-equipped infantry battalion was thrown in front of North Korean armored columns, with commanders assuming the enemy would turn and run at the mere sight of American uniforms. The North Koreans drove their T-34 tanks right over them. The Japanese in 1941, much like the North Koreans in 1950, did not care about the flag, the reputation, or the bluff. They only cared about the math of combat, and the math of combat was about to be dictated from the sky. Let us look at the hardware that made up Force Z. The flagship was the HMS Prince of Wales, a King George V-class battleship, and arguably the most advanced warship in the world at that moment. Displacing over 43,000 tons fully loaded, she was a floating fortress of cemented steel. Her main battery consisted of 10 14-inch guns, housed in 2 massive quadruple turrets and 1 twin turret. Her armor belt was a staggering 14.7 inches thick, designed to shrug off armor-piercing shells from enemy dreadnoughts. She had just survived a brutal slugfest with the German battleship Bismarck a few months prior, proving her extreme survivability in surface-to-surface combat. Sailing alongside her was the HMS Repulse, a renowned-class battlecruiser dating back to the First World War. At 32,000 tons, she carried 6 15-inch guns, packing a devastating punch. But as a battlecruiser, she traded heavy armor for speed, capable of hitting 29 knots. Her armor belt was only 9 inches thick, making her a glass cannon in a modern fight. Commanding this incredibly expensive hardware was Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, a brilliant staff officer with a fatal flaw. Phillips was a traditional battleship admiral to his core. He firmly believed that a heavily armored, fast-moving warship with modern anti-aircraft guns could not be sunk by aircraft while maneuvering in open water. He looked at the growing threat of naval aviation and dismissed it. How could a man with such a brilliant record be so blind to the changing nature of warfare? He was not alone. 20 years earlier, in 1921, U.S. Army Air Service General Billy Mitchell conducted Project B off the Virginia Capes. Mitchell's bombers sank the captured German battleship Ostfriesland, proving definitively that aircraft could sink capital ships. But the battleship admirals in both Washington and London scoffed, arguing that the Ostfriesland was a stationary, undefended target and that a moving ship fighting back would swat planes out of the sky like flies. They buried the lesson. Admiral Phillips carried that same outdated institutional arrogance onto the bridge of the Prince of Wales. But even if Phillips believed his ships could defend themselves, what exactly was his anti-aircraft capability? The Prince of Wales bristled with 16 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns and multiple arrays of the notorious 40mm Vickers 2-pounder, affectionately known as the pom-pom. The 8-barreled pom-pom looked terrifying, throwing a wall of lead into the sky. But there was a massive engineering flaw. The ammunition was fed through canvas and metal belts that warped and stretched in the brutal, humid heat of the tropics. Under sustained fire, these guns were highly prone to jamming, requiring crews to frantically clear the breaches with hammers and crowbars while under attack. Furthermore, the original plan for Force Z included the brand-new aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable, which would have provided a vital umbrella of fighter cover. But the Indomitable ran aground on a coral reef in Jamaica during her workup cruise and was left behind in dry dock. Force Z was naked from the air. Their only potential air support would have to come from the Royal Air Force bases in Malaya. These squadrons were equipped with Brewster F-2A Buffaloes. The Buffalo was a sluggish, overweight fighter that the U.S. Marine Corps would later refer to as a flying coffin during the Battle of Midway. Worse still, the British pilots were inexperienced, and the communication protocols between the Royal Navy and the RAF were practically non-existent. Admiral Phillips, maintaining strict radio silence to hide his movements, had no direct, reliable way to call for these fighters, even if he wanted them. Now let us cross the battle lines and look at the apex predators waiting in the wings. The Japanese 11th Air Fleet, based in occupied French Indochina and Formosa, was not a carrier-based force. These were the elite, land-based naval aviation units of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They flew 2 primary aircraft, the Mitsubishi G3M, codenamed Nell, and the Mitsubishi G4M, codenamed Betty. These twin-engine medium bombers were technological marvels of offensive capability, achieved through a ruthless sacrifice of pilot safety. To achieve their massive operational range of over 2,600 miles, Japanese engineers stripped out all heavy armor plating and removed the self-sealing fuel tanks. They were flying Zippo lighters, prone to exploding violently if hit by incendiary rounds. But that extreme range allowed them to project power far beyond what the British intelligence apparatus believed was possible. More importantly, these bombers carried the Type 91 aerial torpedo. This was not the slow, unreliable junk the Americans were fielding at the start of the war. The Type 91 was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. Weighing 1,870 pounds, it packed a 529-pound high-explosive warhead designed to break the keel of a battleship. The Japanese had equipped these torpedoes with kyotai, special wooden tail stabilizers that broke off upon hitting the water. This ingenious modification prevented the torpedo from diving too deep upon release, allowing it to be dropped in the shallow waters of the South China Sea. The crews of the Genzan, Kanoya, and Mihoro air groups had spent years in rigorous, relentless training, dropping practice torpedoes against moving targets until their coordinated attack patterns were second nature. They had developed an anvil tactic, where multiple squadrons would approach a ship from offsetting angles simultaneously. If the ship turned to comb the wake and dodge one spread of torpedoes, it would expose its broadside directly into the path of the second spread. It was a mathematically inescapable trap. On December 8, 1941, the Japanese launched their massive amphibious invasion of Malaya, landing troops on the beaches of Kota Bharu. Admiral Phillips, sitting in the naval base at Singapore, realized his deterrent had failed. The enemy was at the gates. He had a brutal choice to make. He could keep his billion-dollar fleet safely in port, abandoning the British Army to face the invasion alone. Or he could sortie into the Gulf of Siam and use his massive 14-inch guns to smash the Japanese transport ships into splinters. Phillips chose to fight. He ordered Force Z to weigh anchor and steam north, relying on heavy monsoon rain clouds to cloak his massive ships from Japanese reconnaissance planes. He believed the weather would hold, allowing him to slip in, destroy the invasion fleet, and vanish back into the mist before the enemy bombers could find him. But the weather in the South China Sea is a treacherous, unpredictable beast, and the skies were about to break wide open. On the afternoon of December 9th, the protective cloak of the monsoon vanished. The heavy grey storm clouds that Admiral Phillips had relied upon to hide his fleet suddenly broke, exposing the dark silhouettes of Force Z against the bright, sunlit waters of the South China Sea. Almost immediately, the Japanese submarine I-65, running quietly on the surface, spotted the massive superstructures of the British warships. The hunter had instantly become the hunted. To understand how the British lost the initiative so quickly, we have to look at the technological clash between early radar and elite optical training. The HMS Prince of Wales was equipped with the Type 281 air warning radar, a cutting-edge piece of technology that emitted radio waves at 43 MHz, theoretically capable of detecting aircraft up to 110 miles away. But early radar was incredibly temperamental. The delicate vacuum tubes baked and degraded in the sweltering, humid environment of the tropics, making the system highly unreliable. The Japanese, on the other hand, did not rely on early radar. They relied on the finest optical equipment in the world, specifically the massive Nippon Kogaku binoculars, paired with rigorous, brutal training in visual identification. Japanese lookouts were trained to spot a ship's mast on the horizon miles before the enemy even knew they were there. Once the I-65 transmitted its sighting report, Admiral Phillips knew his element of surprise was completely gone. Why did Admiral Phillips not immediately break radio silence and call for a protective umbrella of RAF fighters right then and there? He was clinging to the desperate, fatal hope that he could still shake his pursuers in the dark. He cancelled the strike on the invasion beaches at Kota Bharu and ordered his fleet to turn south, back toward the safety of Singapore. But war is a landscape of friction and false information. Around midnight, Phillips received a flash intelligence report stating that Japanese forces were landing at Kwantan, a coastal town 400 miles south of his original target. It was a phantom invasion. Jittery British sentries on the beach had fired at shadows and floating logs, sparking a panic that made its way all the way up the chain of command. Believing he had a chance to catch a Japanese landing force completely by surprise, Phillips altered course toward Kwantan, driving his fleet deeper into the kill zone. Meanwhile, back at the Japanese air bases in occupied French Indochina, absolute logistical chaos was unfolding. The 11th Air Fleet had originally loaded their Mitsubishi G3M and G4M bombers with heavy armor-piercing bombs, preparing for a strike against land targets in Singapore. When the submarine report came in, the base commanders ordered an immediate change of ordnance. In the dead of night, under the dim glow of blackout lights, thousands of Japanese ground crewmen frantically scrambled to unload the heavy bombs and winch the massive 1,870-pound Type 91 aerial torpedoes into the bomb bays. We saw this exact same frantic, dangerous rearming process play out on the decks of the American aircraft carriers during the Battle of Midway, where the sudden switching of ordnance left live bombs rolling around the hangar decks. The Japanese ground crews pulled off a logistical miracle, launching 85 heavily laden bombers before dawn on December 10th. These bombers flew in a massive, sprawling grid pattern across the ocean, desperately searching for the British ships. They were burning fuel at an alarming rate. The Mitsubishi bombers had incredible range, but flying heavily loaded with torpedoes while conducting low-altitude search patterns was draining their tanks. It was a race against time and physics, and the Japanese pilots were mere minutes away from having to abort the mission and turn back. But at 10:15 a.m., a sharp-eyed pilot in a Japanese reconnaissance plane spotted the unmistakable wake of the British fleet. He broadcast a long, continuous radio signal, a homing beacon for the rest of the strike force. At 11 a.m., the radar screens inside the Combat Information Centre of the Prince of Wales finally lit up. The first wave of 9 Japanese G3M Nell bombers approached at an altitude of 10,000 feet. This was a high-level bombing run. The British 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. Despite the heavy flak, the Japanese pilots held their V formation with terrifying stoic discipline. They released a string of 550-pound bombs. One of these bombs found its mark, striking the battlecruiser HMS Repulse dead center. The bomb penetrated the catapult deck and exploded violently inside the hangar, destroying the ship's reconnaissance floatplane and starting a raging fire. Captain William Tennant, commanding the Repulse, was a hardened veteran who had survived the chaotic evacuation of Dunkirk. He remained completely calm, ordering his damage control teams to isolate the fire. Within minutes, the blaze was contained, and the Repulse was still cutting through the water at a blistering 25 knots. Did this initial, relatively minor damage lure the British commanders into a false sense of security? Absolutely. High-altitude bombing against rapidly moving warships was notoriously inaccurate, generally yielding a hit rate of less than 3% in combat conditions. Admiral Phillips, standing on the bridge of his flagship, likely watched the Repulse shrug off the hit and concluded that this was the best the Japanese aviation could do. He was dead wrong. At 11:30 a.m., the real killers arrived. 17 torpedo bombers dropped down from the clouds, descending to just 100 feet above the waves, skimming the ocean surface like predatory birds. They split into 2 distinct squadrons, perfectly executing the anvil attack doctrine they had practiced for years. The British anti-aircraft gunners frantically depressed their barrels to engage the low-flying threats. The 8-barreled pom-pom guns began to hammer away, throwing a wall of 2-pounder shells into the air. But just as the engineers had feared, the intense tropical heat had warped the canvas ammunition belts. Gun after gun began to jam. Desperate gun crews were seen beating the breeches of their weapons with hammers and crowbars, trying to clear the jams, while Japanese bombers roared right over their heads. The Prince of Wales immediately initiated hard, evasive maneuvers, turning sharply to comb the wake and present the narrowest possible profile to the incoming torpedoes. The ship was designed to survive this exact scenario. Her torpedo defense system, or TDS, was an engineering marvel. It consisted of a layered defense. First, an outer air-filled void space designed to trigger the torpedo's detonator. Second, a liquid-filled compartment designed to absorb and distribute the kinetic shock wave of the blast. Finally, a 1.5-inch thick armored holding bulkhead designed to keep the seawater out of the vital engine spaces. This system was mathematically calculated to completely absorb a 1,000-pound TNT warhead. The Japanese Type 91 torpedo only carried a 529-pound explosive charge. If the math heavily favored the British armor, how did a single torpedo turn a 43,000-ton super dreadnought into a sinking tomb? The answer lies in the cruelest twist of mechanical fate in naval history. At 11:44 a.m., a single torpedo struck the Prince of Wales on her port side, far aft, right at the specific structural weak point where the outboard propeller shaft exited the heavily armored hull. The explosion itself did not breach the inner hull. Instead, the blast violently bent the massive, solid steel propeller shaft. But the ship's engines were still running at full combat power. This bent, twisted shaft, spinning at hundreds of revolutions per minute, instantly became a giant, uncontrollable mechanical whip inside the ship. It violently tore apart the shaft alley, ripping through the watertight bulkheads from the inside out. The spinning metal shredded the ship's internal organs before the engines could be shut down. Thousands of tons of seawater immediately rushed into the port engine room. The Prince of Wales instantly took on a massive 11.5-degree list to port. Even worse, the flooding short-circuited the main electrical generators on that side of the ship. Half of the battleship's electrical power was instantly wiped out. Without electricity, the massive 5.25-inch anti-aircraft turrets on the aft section of the ship could not be rotated or elevated. The ventilation systems failed, plunging the men trapped in the lower decks into complete, sweltering darkness as the water rose around them. We saw this exact same fatal design flaw doom the German battleship Bismarck just a few months earlier, where a single, lucky torpedo jammed the rudder and left the ship steering in circles. A multi-million-dollar fortress of impenetrable steel, completely defeated by a single strike to its exposed, fragile mobility appendages. The pride of the Royal Navy is now a crippled, bleeding giant, dragging its dead weight through the water, while the radar screens light up with the horrifying signature of 26 more Japanese bombers closing in for the kill. The 26 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers of the Kanoya and Kisarazu air groups descended for the kill. Unlike the first wave, these crews were seasoned veterans of the brutal air war over China, operating with cold, mechanical precision. The crippled Prince of Wales, listing heavily to port and bleeding massive trails of heavy fuel oil, was a sitting duck. She could barely make 15 knots, her steering gear was failing, and the total loss of electrical power meant her heavy 5.25-inch anti-aircraft turrets were being cranked by hand. Imagine the sheer physical terror of trying to manually rotate a massive steel turret weighing dozens of tons while the deck is tilted at an 11-degree angle, and enemy bombers are screaming in at 200 miles per hour. It is a physical impossibility. At 12:22 p.m., the Japanese executed a flawless anvil attack on the helpless flagship. 4 torpedoes slammed into her starboard side. The mathematical limits of her torpedo defense system were instantly overwhelmed by the sheer, concentrated volume of high explosives. 1 torpedo struck perfectly in line with the forward turrets, another shattered the outer hull near the boiler rooms, and a third struck far aft. The majestic super dreadnought, the pride of the British Empire, was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. But what about the HMS Repulse? Captain William Tennant was putting on a masterclass in desperate ship handling. Sailing at 27 knots, Tennant aggressively maneuvered his World War I-era battlecruiser, violently turning the massive ship's wheel to comb the wakes of the incoming torpedoes. Through sheer skill and situational awareness, he successfully dodged an astonishing 19 torpedoes. His crew cheered from the decks as they watched the lethal weapons streak harmlessly past the hull in the crystal-clear water. But luck is a rapidly depleting resource on a battlefield dominated by overwhelming air power. At 12:33 p.m., the Japanese adjusted their tactics, attacking the Repulse from multiple vectors simultaneously. If Tennant turned away from the bombers approaching on his port bow, he exposed his long, thinly armoured broadside directly to the bombers dropping on his starboard quarter. The trap snapped shut. 1 torpedo struck the port side, followed seconds later by 3 massive detonations, tearing open the starboard side. The aging battlecruiser shuddered violently as thousands of tons of seawater rushed into her lower engine rooms. Captain Tennant, realizing his ship was mortally wounded, remained completely stoic. He keyed the ship's public address system and gave the order to abandon ship. Just 6 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the HMS Repulse rolled over and plunged into the depths of the South China Sea. Back on the Prince of Wales, the situation was equally terminal. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips and Captain John Leach stood silently on the bridge, watching their invincible steel fortress slowly sink beneath their feet. They made no attempt to save themselves, refusing to enter the life rafts. They went down with their ship, victims of their own unyielding faith in a bygone era of naval warfare. At 1:20 p.m., the Prince of Wales capsized and vanished beneath the waves. Almost exactly at that moment, the first Brewster Buffalo fighters of the Royal Air Force finally arrived over the battle space. They found nothing but a massive slick of black oil, floating debris, and hundreds of exhausted British sailors clinging to life rafts. The Japanese bombers were already gone, flying back to their bases in Indochina with empty bomb bays and a stunning, world-altering victory. Why did this happen? To truly understand the strategic earthquake of December 10th, we must strip away the emotion and look at the cold, hard lessons of intelligence, logistics, and technological hubris. First, let us examine the catastrophic intelligence failure. The British military establishment in 1941 was infected with a lethal strain of cultural arrogance. Intelligence reports circulating in London and Singapore routinely dismissed Japanese pilots as myopic, claiming they lacked the night vision and inner ear balance required for complex aerial maneuvers. They believed Japanese aircraft were nothing more than cheap, fragile copies of outdated Western designs. They completely ignored the after-action reports coming out of the Sino-Japanese War, which clearly demonstrated the lethal efficiency and long range of Japanese naval aviation. This is the exact same catastrophic arrogance that doomed General George Armstrong Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Before marching into the Dakota Territory, Custer was offered a battery of Gatling guns to provide overwhelming fire support. He flatly refused them, believing his elite 7th Cavalry could easily ride down any number of Native American warriors, whom he dismissed as primitive and unorganized. He left his heavy firepower behind, just as Admiral Phillips left behind his air cover, riding blindly into a mathematically unwinnable trap. When you base your tactical doctrine on a racist or arrogant underestimation of your enemy, you are writing your own death warrant. From a logistical perspective, the sinking of Force Z highlights the brutal tyranny of distance in the Pacific theater. The Japanese 11th Air Fleet pushed their Mitsubishi bombers to the absolute ragged edge of their operational range. They flew over 400 miles just to reach the target area, spent hours conducting fuel-heavy grid searches, engaged in high-speed combat maneuvers, and then had to fly 400 miles back. Many of those bombers landed in Indochina, running on literal fumes, with engines sputtering out the moment their wheels touched the runway. It was a massive operational gamble by the Japanese command. If the weather had remained cloudy, or if Admiral Phillips had maintained his course for Kota Baru instead of chasing a phantom intelligence report at Kwantan, the Japanese bombers would have hit their bingo fuel marks and been forced to turn back empty-handed. Logistics dictate the absolute boundaries of strategy. On the British side, the logistics were equally damning. Even if the Prince of Wales had somehow miraculously limped back to Singapore with a bent propeller shaft and a flooded engine room, it would not have mattered. The naval base at Singapore, despite decades of massive funding, lacked the specialized dry dock facilities and the heavy industrial machinery required to repair a heavily damaged King George V-class battleship. She would have been a sitting duck in the harbour, just like the American battleships at Pearl Harbor. Winston Churchill sent a strategic asset into a theatre that possessed absolutely zero logistical infrastructure to support it. This brings us to the political and economic dimension of this disaster. Force Z was a political bluff, a geopolitical chess piece moved onto the board by a prime minister desperate to project strength to his allies and fear to his enemies. But warships are not political statements. They are highly complex, incredibly expensive industrial assets that require massive logistical tails and combined arms support to simply survive in a modern threat environment. The loss of the Prince of Wales and Repulse was an economic catastrophe for a British Empire that was already bankrupting itself to fight Nazi Germany in the Atlantic. You cannot simply build another super dreadnought overnight. It takes years of steel production, specialized labor, and millions of pounds sterling. The Japanese understood this economic reality perfectly. By risking a few dozen relatively cheap mass-produced bombers, they permanently eliminated billions of dollars worth of British naval infrastructure. It was an asymmetrical economic exchange of the highest order. We saw a similar asymmetrical shock decades later during the Vietnam War, particularly during the Tet Offensive in 1968. The American political and military leadership, relying on overwhelming firepower and massive defense budgets, was convinced the Viet Cong were on the verge of total collapse. They relied on a strategy of attrition, believing the enemy could not sustain the economic and human cost of a prolonged conflict. But the Tet Offensive proved that a highly motivated, lightly equipped force could completely shatter the political illusion of control, regardless of the massive technological disparity. The Japanese bombers off the coast of Malaya shattered the illusion of British imperial control just as violently. The strategic fallout was immediate and irreversible. Without the threat of Force Z, the Japanese amphibious supply lines into Malaya were completely secure. The Japanese army marched down the Malayan peninsula, outflanking, outmaneuvering, and destroying the British, Indian, and Australian forces at every turn. Just 2 months later, on February 15, 1942, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore unconditionally surrendered. Over 80,000 Allied troops marched into brutal captivity. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse was the tactical catalyst that made that massive strategic collapse inevitable. It also marked a definitive, undeniable paradigm shift in the history of human conflict. December 10, 1941, was the day the battleship died. For 3 centuries, the ship of the line, bristling with heavy guns and thick armor, had been the ultimate arbiter of global power. Nations measured their worth by the size and tonnage of their dreadnought fleets. But in less than 2 hours, a handful of unarmored twin-engine aircraft, armed with wooden-finned torpedoes, rendered all of that steel and armor completely obsolete. The torch of naval supremacy was violently passed from the battleship admiral to the naval aviator. The United States Navy, forced by the destruction at Pearl Harbor to rely on its surviving aircraft carriers, would take this bloody lesson to heart. They would build the greatest naval aviation armada in human history, culminating in the complete annihilation of the Imperial Japanese Navy just 3 years later. Ironically, the Japanese themselves would eventually fall victim to the exact same battleship hubris. In April 1945, they sent their own super dreadnought, the mighty Yamato, on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa without any protective air cover. Hundreds of American carrier-based torpedo bombers swarmed the Yamato, tearing her apart in a mirror image of what happened to Force Z. The hunters had become the hunted, destroyed by the very tactical doctrine they had perfected. War is a ruthless, unsentimental auditor. It does not care about your traditions, the thickness of your armor, or the political rhetoric of your leaders. If you fail to adapt to the changing technology of the battlefield, you will be destroyed by an enemy who has. Now, I want to hear from you. Which factor do you believe was the most fatal mistake made by the British command regarding Force Z? A. The catastrophic intelligence failure and underestimation of Japanese naval aviation capabilities. B. Admiral Phillips' stubborn refusal to break radio silence and call for RAF fighter support until it was too late. C. Winston Churchill's political decision to deploy unsupported capital ships as a bluff without a proper logistical tail. Let me know your choice in the comments below and defend your position.